Chester had been digging in that same spot for 3 days straight, not just scratching around like pigs do, digging with the desperate intensity of something that knew exactly what it was looking for. But what Tobias Marsh didn't realize yet was that his prize pig had found something that should have stayed buried forever. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ranch as Tobias walked toward the pen, coffee mug in hand. He'd built this place with his own 2 hands 20 years ago, back when Ruth was still alive to share the dream. Now it was just him and the animals, and Chester was making his life miserable. The massive Yorkshire pig had worn a hole 3 feet deep in the northeast corner of his pen. Every time Tobias filled it back in, Chester would return to the exact same spot and start digging again. The animal's snout was raw from the constant scraping against rocks and roots. Tobias leaned against the fence post, watching Chester work with methodical determination. The pig's breathing came in heavy snorts as he pushed dirt aside with his powerful snout, then used his hooves to clear away the loose soil. There was something almost human about the way Chester paused occasionally, as if listening for something buried deep below. Other ranchers had told him pigs were smart, but this went beyond intelligence. This was obsession. Chester barely touched his food anymore, spending every daylight hour at that hole. His penmate, a smaller pig named Dolly, had given up trying to get his attention and now kept to the opposite corner, watching nervously. Tobias had tried everything. He'd moved Chester's food to the far side of the pen, hoping to distract him. He'd even put up a barrier around the hole. Chester had simply pushed through it and resumed digging. The strange part was how precise Chester was. Other pigs root around randomly, following their noses to wherever the scent takes them, but Chester returned to the exact same square foot of earth every single time, as if something specific was calling to him from below. Tobias drained his coffee and shook his head. 23 years he'd been raising pigs, and he'd never seen behavior like this. Ruth used to say animals could sense things humans couldn't. Earthquakes, storms, death approaching. But what could Chester possibly be sensing 6 feet underground? As he turned to head back to the house, Tobias heard something that made him stop cold. Chester had stopped digging and was making a low, mournful sound, not the usual grunt or squeal of a pig, but something that sounded almost like crying. Tobias looked back at the hole. In all his years on this ranch, he'd never heard an animal make a sound quite like that, and Chester was staring right at him, as if trying to tell him something urgent. Something was down there, and Chester wouldn't stop until he found it. That afternoon, Tobias found himself standing at the hole with a shovel in his hands. He'd tried to dismiss Chester's behavior as animal instinct gone wrong, but that mournful cry had stayed with him. 23 years of raising livestock had taught him to trust when something felt off. The hole was deeper than he'd realized. Chester had carved out a perfect circle, about 4 feet across, with steep sides that showed the pig had been digging systematically rather than randomly. The bottom was packed hard from Chester's constant trampling, but along the edges Tobias could see scratches in the earth that looked almost deliberate. He climbed into the pen, causing Chester to back away reluctantly. The pig watched every movement as Tobias knelt beside the hole and ran his hand along the walls. The soil felt different here, looser than the packed clay that made up most of his property, almost as if this section had been disturbed before. Tobias pushed the shovel into the bottom of the hole. It sank deeper than expected, meeting less resistance than it should have. He dug carefully, removing one shovelful at a time while Chester paced behind him, snorting with what seemed like approval. 3 feet down, the shovel struck something that wasn't dirt or rock, something that gave slightly under pressure then pushed back. Tobias felt his heart rate quicken as he cleared away the soil around the obstruction. A piece of fabric emerged from the earth, faded blue material that looked like it had been buried for years. Tobias brushed away more dirt, revealing what appeared to be part of a shirt or jacket. The fabric was old but intact, protected by the clay soil from complete decay. Chester had gone completely silent now, standing perfectly still as he watched Tobias work. The other animals on the ranch seemed to sense something too. The chickens had stopped their usual chatter, and even the horses in the distant pasture had gathered near the fence, all facing toward the pig pen. Tobias carefully lifted the fabric. Underneath, his fingers touched something smooth and curved. He cleared away more soil and found himself looking at what was unmistakably a human ribcage. His hands began to shake as the reality hit him. Chester hadn't been digging randomly. The pig had somehow detected human remains buried beneath his pen. But who was down there, and how long had they been buried on his land? Tobias sat back on his heels, his mind racing. This ranch had belonged to his family for 3 generations. His grandfather had built the original homestead, his father had expanded it, and Tobias had inherited it clean and clear. There were no records of anyone being buried here, no family cemetery, no mention of anything that would explain human bones on his property. But someone was definitely down there, and from the looks of the fabric and the condition of the bones, they'd been there for a very long time. Chester made a soft grunt and stepped closer to the hole, as if asking Tobias to keep digging. The pig's eyes held an intelligence that made Tobias uncomfortable. It was almost as if Chester knew exactly who was buried there. And somehow, Tobias was beginning to suspect he should know too. Tobias climbed out of the pen and walked to his house on unsteady legs. His hands were still shaking as he poured himself 3 fingers of whiskey and sat down at his kitchen table. The human remains in Chester's hole changed everything, but he couldn't figure out how or why. He pulled out the old photo albums Ruth had insisted on keeping, searching for any clue about his family's history on this land. His grandfather, Jonas Marsh, had established the ranch in 1891. His father, Samuel, had worked it until his death 10 years ago. 3 generations of Marshes, and none of them had ever mentioned anyone being buried on the property. But as Tobias flipped through faded photographs, one image stopped him cold. A picture from 1923 showed his grandfather standing next to the original farmhouse with several other men. One of them looked familiar, though Tobias couldn't place where he'd seen that face before. The man was tall and lean, wearing the same style of blue shirt Tobias had just pulled from the grave. He stood slightly apart from the others, and there was something in his posture that suggested tension. On the back of the photo, someone had written names in pencil: Jonas, Samuel, Marcus Webb, Theodore Pike. Marcus Webb. Tobias had never heard that name before, but something about it felt significant. He studied the man's face again, noting the sharp cheekbones and deep-set eyes. There was an intensity there that made Tobias uncomfortable, even across a century of time. He returned to the pen as the sun began to set. Chester was lying beside the hole now, his massive head resting near the edge as if keeping vigil. When he saw Tobias approaching, the pig stood and moved aside expectantly. Tobias resumed digging, this time with more purpose. The bones were definitely human. He could make out what appeared to be a complete skeleton, lying on its side in a position that suggested the person had been placed there deliberately. This wasn't someone who had died and been properly buried. This was someone who had been hidden. As he carefully removed more soil, Tobias discovered other items mixed in with the remains. A leather belt with a distinctive silver buckle, a pair of worn boots, and something that made his blood run cold. A small metal star, tarnished with age but still clearly recognizable as a sheriff's badge. The badge was engraved with Sheriff Marcus Webb and dated 1923, the same year as the photograph. The same man who had stood with his grandfather and father, wearing the same blue shirt that was now wrapped around his bones. Tobias sat back and looked at Chester, who was watching him with those unsettlingly intelligent eyes. Somehow, this pig had led him to discover that a sheriff from 1923 was buried on his family's land. But sheriffs don't just disappear and get buried in secret. They get murdered. And if Marcus Webb had been killed and buried here, that meant someone in his family knew about it. Someone had put him in the ground and kept the secret for over a century. Chester made that mournful sound again, and this time Tobias understood. The pig wasn't just digging randomly. Chester had found a murder that someone had tried very hard to keep buried. But as Tobias stared at the sheriff's badge in his trembling hand, he realized the most terrifying part wasn't what Chester had found. It was what finding it meant about his own family's past. Tobias spent the night searching through every document his family had left behind: birth certificates, property deeds, tax records, anything that might explain why Sheriff Marcus Webb was buried on their land. But the more he searched, the more questions arose. According to the county records he found in an old trunk, Marcus Webb had been reported missing in September 1923. The official report stated he had disappeared while investigating cattle rustling in the area. His body was never found, and the case went cold. But Tobias now knew exactly where Webb had ended up. What disturbed him most were the dates. Webb had disappeared on September 15th, 1923. According to his grandfather's journal, which Tobias had never bothered to read before, that was the exact same day Jonas Marsh had suddenly acquired a significant amount of money. enough to buy the additional land that had doubled the size of their ranch. The journal entries were sparse, but Jonas had written, "The Webb matter is settled. We can move forward now." 3 days later, bought the Morrison plot. Our troubles are behind us. Tobias felt sick as the implications became clear. His grandfather hadn't just known about Webb's disappearance, he had been involved in it. And that involvement had apparently made the family wealthy enough to expand their holdings significantly. As dawn broke, Tobias returned to the pen. Chester was waiting for him, standing guard over the grave like a faithful sentinel. But something had changed overnight. The pig was no longer focused on the hole. Instead, Chester kept looking toward the old barn that had stood on the property since his grandfather's time. Following Chester's gaze, Tobias walked to the barn and began searching areas he'd never paid much attention to. In the loft, behind stacks of moldering hay, he found a metal box that had been hidden for decades. Inside were documents that made his hands shake as he read them. Sheriff Webb hadn't been investigating cattle rustling when he disappeared. He'd been investigating his own deputy, Theodore Pike, the other man in the photograph, for taking bribes from cattle thieves. And according to Webb's notes, Pike had been working with local ranchers to cover up the thefts, including Jonas Marsh. But the most damning document was a letter Webb had written but never sent, addressed to the territorial marshal. In it, he detailed his evidence against Pike and Jonas Marsh, stating his intention to arrest both men on September 15, 1923. The letter was dated September 14th. Webb had come to arrest his grandfather, and instead had ended up buried in what would become Chester's pen. Jonas Marsh and Theodore Pike had murdered a lawman to protect their criminal enterprise, then used the profits to buy more land and legitimize their operations. Tobias looked back toward the pen, where Chester continued his patient vigil. The pig had somehow sensed the injustice buried beneath the soil and had spent days trying to bring it to light. A century of silence, broken by a pig who refused to let the dead stay hidden. But as Tobias held the evidence of his family's dark past, he faced an impossible choice. He could report the discovery and expose his grandfather's crimes, destroying the reputation his family had built over generations, or he could rebury the truth and let Chester's efforts be in vain. Chester was watching him from across the yard, and Tobias could swear the animal was waiting to see what kind of man he would choose to be. Would he honor the law that Webb had died trying to uphold, or would he protect the legacy built on that lawman's murder? The pig made that mournful sound again, and this time it sounded like a plea for justice that had been waiting 100 years to be heard. Tobias sat on his porch for hours, staring at the documents that could destroy everything his family had built. The weight of a century-old murder pressed down on him like a physical force. Every board beneath his feet, every fence post around his property, every improvement his father and grandfather had made, all of it paid for with blood money. Chester had wandered over and now lay at the base of the porch steps, his massive head resting on his front hooves. The pig's eyes never left Tobias's face, as if he understood the magnitude of the decision being made. The smart thing would be to burn the evidence and rebury Webb's remains somewhere far from the ranch. No one else knew what Chester had found. The sheriff's case had been cold for 100 years. No one was coming to look for answers now. Tobias could protect his family's reputation and keep the ranch that had been his whole life. But every time he looked at Chester, he remembered that mournful cry. Webb had died trying to do the right thing, and his killer had prospered. For a century, the lawman's body had lain in unmarked ground, while Jonas Marsh's name was honored throughout the county as a founding father and respected rancher. Tobias thought about Ruth, who had always believed in justice above convenience. She would have told him to do the right thing, regardless of the cost. But Ruth wasn't here to face the consequences. She wasn't here to watch their life's work crumble because of sins committed before they were born. As the sun reached its peak, Tobias found himself walking back to the pen. Chester immediately stood and joined him at the edge of the grave. Together, they looked down at the remains of Marcus Webb, the sheriff who had tried to bring criminals to justice and paid with his life. If you were Tobias, what would you do? Honor your family's legacy and rebury the truth to protect everything you've worked for, or expose a century-old murder and face the destruction of your reputation and livelihood? Tell me in the comments. I need to know which side you'd choose, because what Tobias decided next would either put this injustice to rest forever or finally give Marcus Webb the justice he died trying to uphold. Tobias knelt beside the grave and carefully lifted Webb's badge, feeling its weight in his palm. The metal was cold, but somehow it seemed to pulse with the authority the man had carried in life. This wasn't just a piece of tin. It was a symbol of everything Webb had stood for. Chester made a soft grunt and stepped closer, pressing his snout gently against Tobias's shoulder. The gesture felt almost like comfort, as if the pig understood the difficulty of the choice, but also knew what needed to be done. Tobias looked around his ranch, the land that had sustained 3 generations of his family, the home where he'd planned to live out his days. All of it built on a foundation of murder and corruption. How could he continue to benefit from a crime that had destroyed a good man's life? But as he stood up, badge in hand, Tobias noticed something else in the grave that he'd missed before, something that would make his decision even more complicated and more dangerous. Tucked beneath Webb's ribcage was a small leather pouch, and from what Tobias could see, it contained more than just personal effects. Whatever was in that pouch might hold secrets that went far beyond his grandfather's involvement in the sheriff's death. If you're enjoying the story, subscribe to the channel. Chester was staring at the pouch too, and his expression had changed from mournful to urgent. The pig knew there was more to discover. And somehow, Tobias suspected that what they found next would make everything else seem simple by comparison. With trembling hands, Tobias carefully extracted the leather pouch from beneath Webb's remains. The material was well preserved by the clay soil, and as he opened it, his breath caught in his throat. Inside weren't just personal effects. There were photographs, documents, and what appeared to be a detailed map of the entire county. The photographs showed things that made Tobias's stomach turn. Images of cattle with brands that had been altered, groups of men loading stolen livestock onto trains, and most damning of all, clear pictures of Theodore Pike and Jonas Marsh directing the operations. Webb hadn't just been investigating small-time cattle rustling. He'd uncovered a massive organized theft ring that stretched across 3 counties. But it was the map that made everything clear. Red X's marked locations throughout the territory, with dates and numbers written beside each one. Tobias recognized several of the locations as ranches that had belonged to his grandfather's business partners, men who had mysteriously prospered during the same period Jonas Marsh had expanded his holdings. At the bottom of the pouch was a list of names, and Tobias's blood ran cold as he read them. These weren't just local ranchers. They included the territorial governor, 2 federal marshals, and the railroad commissioner. Webb had discovered that the cattle rustling operation was being protected at the highest levels of government. Chester pressed closer, as if sensing the magnitude of what had been uncovered. This wasn't just about his grandfather's crimes anymore. Webb had died because he'd discovered corruption that reached all the way to the territorial capital. His murder hadn't just silenced one honest lawman. It had allowed an entire network of criminals to continue operating for decades. Among the documents was Webb's final report, written in careful handwriting and addressed to the U.S. Marshal Service in Denver. In it, he detailed how stolen cattle were being moved through a network of corrupt officials, sold to government contractors, and the profits shared among everyone from local ranchers to territorial politicians. The operation was worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, a fortune in 1923. But what horrified Tobias most was the realization that the corruption hadn't ended with Webb's death. Looking at the names on the list, he recognized family names that still held power in the county today. Descendants of the original conspirators now served as mayors, judges, and business leaders. The network Webb had died trying to expose had simply evolved and continued. As he studied the map more carefully, Tobias noticed something that made his heart race. Several of the marked locations corresponded to areas where other ranchers had reported finding human remains over the years, discoveries that had been quickly dismissed by local authorities as old Indian burial grounds or forgotten graves from the territorial period. Webb hadn't been the only person murdered to protect this conspiracy. The map suggested at least 6 other locations where bodies might be buried, all marked with dates between 1923 and 1925. The cattle rustling ring had eliminated anyone who posed a threat, and the evidence had been scattered across the territory. Chester made that urgent sound again and began walking toward the barn. When Tobias followed, the pig led him to a section of floor that looked different from the rest. Newer boards that had clearly been replaced at some point. Chester began pawing at the boards, just as he had done at the gravesite. Tobias pried up the loose boards and found another hiding place, this one containing a metal strongbox. Inside were stacks of money, more cash than Tobias had ever seen in one place. But it wasn't modern currency. These were bills and coins from the 1920s, apparently Webb's evidence of the payoffs that kept the conspiracy functioning. A note attached to the money was written in his grandfather's handwriting. Payment for services rendered. The Webb problem is permanent. T. Pike sends his regards. The date was September 16, 1923, one day after Webb's disappearance. Tobias now understood the full scope of what Chester had uncovered. His grandfather hadn't just participated in cattle rustling and murder. He had been paid handsomely to help cover up the crimes. The expansion of their ranch hadn't been funded by legitimate success, but by blood money from a conspiracy that had claimed multiple lives. And somewhere out there, the descendants of the other conspirators were still benefiting from wealth built on a foundation of murder and corruption, completely unaware that a pig named Chester had just exposed the truth they thought was buried forever. Tobias spent the next morning making copies of every document, photograph, and piece of evidence Webb had gathered. He photographed the badge, the money, and even the map with its damning red X's marking burial sites across the county. If he was going to expose this conspiracy, he needed to ensure the evidence couldn't be destroyed or dismissed. Chester followed him everywhere, as if understanding that his discovery had set something momentous in motion. The pig's behavior had returned to normal in every way except one. He refused to leave Tobias's side, as though he sensed danger approaching. That afternoon, Tobias drove into town to visit the County Historical Society. He needed to verify the names on Webb's list and understand how many of the families mentioned still held power in the area. What he discovered made his decision inevitable. Martha Kellerman, the elderly historian, was eager to help when Tobias mentioned researching his family's history. But when he showed her photocopies of some of the names from Webb's documents, her expression changed dramatically. "Where did you find these names together?" she asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Old family papers," Tobias replied carefully. "Why?" Martha looked around nervously, then leaned closer. "My grandfather used to tell stories about a corruption scandal in the 1920s. He said Sheriff Webb was getting close to exposing something big when he disappeared. But anyone who tried to investigate further seemed to have accidents or decided to leave town suddenly." She pulled out a thick folder from a locked cabinet. "I've been researching this for years, but I never had enough evidence to prove anything. These families you're asking about, their descendants still run this county. The current mayor, the police chief, 2 of the county commissioners, even the district attorney. They're all descended from people on your list." Tobias felt the weight of Webb's badge in his pocket. The conspiracy hadn't just survived, it had evolved into a political dynasty that controlled local law enforcement and government. Exposing the truth wouldn't just reveal historical crimes, it would threaten the power structure that had ruled the county for a century. "There's something else," Martha whispered. 3 people have tried to research this story in the past 20 years. One had a car accident, one moved away after receiving threats, and one simply disappeared. If you're thinking of pursuing this, you need to be very careful about who you trust. As Tobias drove home, he noticed a black truck following him at a distance. When he turned onto his ranch road, the truck continued past, but he caught a glimpse of the driver, a man wearing a police uniform. Someone was already watching him. That evening, as he sat on his porch reviewing the evidence one last time, Tobias heard vehicles approaching. 3 trucks pulled into his yard, and men climbed out. Men he recognized as local businessmen and officials. Leading them was Police Chief Raymond Pike, great-grandson of Theodore Pike, the corrupt deputy who had helped murder Webb. "Evening, Tobias," Chief Pike called out, his hand resting casually on his service weapon. "Heard you've been asking questions about old family history. Mind if we have a chat?" Chester emerged from behind the house, positioning himself between Tobias and the visitors. The pig's body language was unmistakably threatening, his hackles raised, and a low growl rumbling from his throat. Even in the face of armed men, Chester was ready to protect the man who had listened to his warnings. "We know what you found," Pike continued, stepping closer, "and we know you've been making copies. That was a mistake, Tobias. A big mistake." Tobias stood slowly, feeling Webb's badge in his pocket and thinking about the lawman who had died trying to expose these same families a century ago. History was repeating itself, but this time, there was a witness who couldn't be silenced. The entire county would soon know the truth because Tobias had already mailed copies of everything to newspapers and law enforcement agencies outside the county's influence. "Too late," Tobias said simply. "The truth is already out there." Pike's expression darkened as he realized he was facing the same situation his great-grandfather had faced in 1923. But unlike Webb, Tobias had prepared for this moment, and Chester wasn't going to let another good man disappear without a fight. The standoff lasted only moments before the sound of sirens filled the air. Federal agents and state investigators poured onto the ranch, surrounding Pike and his men before they could react. Tobias had spent the morning not just making copies, but calling every law enforcement agency outside the county's influence. Pike's face went pale as he realized the trap had closed around him. "You have no idea what you've done," he snarled. "Do you know how many families you're going to destroy?" "I know exactly what I've done," Tobias replied, pulling Webb's badge from his pocket. "I've given Marcus Webb the justice he died trying to achieve." The federal agents moved quickly, arresting Pike and his associates while securing the evidence Tobias had gathered. Special Agent Sarah Mitchell, who led the team, examined Webb's documents with growing amazement. "This is the most complete evidence of historical corruption we've ever encountered," she told Tobias. "Your pig didn't just find a murder victim. He uncovered what might be the longest-running criminal conspiracy in territorial history." Chester watched the proceedings with what could only be described as satisfaction. As the corrupt officials were led away in handcuffs, the pig returned to his pen and lay down peacefully for the first time in weeks. His work was finally done. The investigation that followed made national headlines. Webb's evidence led to the discovery of 6 more burial sites across 3 counties. Exactly as his map had indicated. DNA testing confirmed the identities of several victims, other law enforcement officers, journalists, and honest officials who had threatened the conspiracy over the years. Mayor Patricia Kellerman, District Attorney Robert Morrison, and 12 other officials were arrested as the investigation expanded. The network Webb had died trying to expose finally crumbled under the weight of evidence a pig had refused to let stay buried. Martha Kellerman, the historian, became the key witness in explaining how the conspiracy had evolved over generations. "They thought they were safe because they'd buried the truth," she testified. "But truth has a way of surfacing when you least expect it." The trials lasted 2 years and resulted in dozens of convictions. Property seized from the conspiracy was worth millions of dollars. Wealth accumulated over a century of corruption. Much of it was returned to the families of victims or donated to law enforcement training programs. Tobias faced a difficult choice about his ranch, which had been expanded using blood money. After long consideration, he donated the additional land his grandfather had purchased with Webb's murder money to establish the Marcus Webb Memorial Park, complete with a proper grave for the sheriff and monuments to all the conspiracy's victims. Chester lived out his days as something of a celebrity, featured in newspapers and television programs as the pig who solved a century-old murder. Visitors came from across the country to meet the animal who had refused to let injustice stay buried. Chester seemed to enjoy the attention, though he never again showed any interest in digging. If you're enjoying the story, subscribe to the channel. Tobias kept a smaller portion of the original ranch and continued farming, but his life had changed completely. He became an advocate for cold case investigations and worked with law enforcement agencies to solve other historical crimes. The experience had taught him that sometimes the most important thing you can do is listen when someone, even a pig, is trying to tell you something important. Years later, when people asked him how he'd found the courage to expose his own family's crimes, Tobias would always credit Chester. "He showed me that some truths are too important to stay buried," he would say, "and that justice doesn't have an expiration date." Chester lived to be 14 years old, passing peacefully in his sleep. When they buried him, Tobias placed a small replica of Webb's badge beside him. It seemed fitting that the pig who had brought a murdered lawman justice should carry a badge of honor into whatever comes after this life. The Marcus Webb case became a model for investigating historical corruption, and Chester's story inspired dozens of cold case reopenings across the country. Sometimes justice takes a century to arrive, but it arrives nonetheless, especially when you have a determined pig who refuses to give up digging for the truth. Now click on the video on the screen to hear a story even better than this one, with a twist so powerful you won't forget it anytime soon. Click on the video now.